Matthew. Matthew, I think you will have read, all of you will have read his CV, and he is an airborne, was trained after his military service as an airborne combat search and rescue paramedic. So absolutely qualified to talk to us about the subject he's going to raise. So I will hand over now to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Derek. Good evening, everyone. And it's my honor to be with you here this evening for what I think is going to be a very interesting 45 minutes. I thank you and a very warm welcome to you all. This evening, we are going to cover a brief intro into the sort of historical side of military medicine and also the origins of more modern sort of British military Casabac and Medevac. We'll be talking about a bit about my personal background, a bit about sort of the background to Afghanistan, the early presence of the British in that particular area, as well as some of the historical types of small arms injuries compared to those of modern theatre of operations. We'll also be talking about some of the advances that have been made more recently in terms of battlefield trauma and resuscitation. I'll also cover some of the aircraft that we flew on, so just touching briefly on some of the armaments and countermeasures they carried. And then we'll talk a bit about some personal kits and firearms that we carried into the field. There is a very short study that I'm going to share with you. There are no gory pictures in tonight's presentation. You'll be happy to know there's plenty of that out there on the big wide world web. Then we're also going to be talking about some of the other taskings that I performed with the British military, and then conclude and some references at the end. As Derek mentioned, there will be an opportunity for questions at the end. So, please feel free to pre-formulate these and pop them into the chat on here. So there are in all of our journeys and lives, I believe, interesting intersections, and some may say there is coincidence or chance meeting of people. I wonder if you would agree with my sort of view on that. For as long as I can remember, I have had an innate drive to preserve life, and this ethos of Ubuntu, or the African sort of culture of I am, therefore we are, was instilled in me by my parents, and particularly my mother, who was fluent in the Bantu languages of Zulu and Xhosa primarily. I mainly spoke Afrikaans and Zulu until I was about 7 years old. And I have quite a mixed sort of heritage, with my paternal great-grandmother being from the Barolong people. My maternal 8th great-grandfather was a gentleman called Dr. Jean-Pierre Duplessis. He was a French Huguenot, and he sailed in 1638 to the Cape of Good Hope, where he practiced as a surgeon. So in terms of my own bushcraft and hunting skills, these were honed in the 1970s, while following in some of my uncle's footsteps. My uncles grew up in northern KwaZulu-Natal, around the areas of Mahlabatini, Kantla, Babanangu, Vryheid, and that area. And one of the family farms, Geleekwater, is interestingly on part of the site of the Battle of Talana Hill, and was used by both British and Boer forces as a medical hospital. My father, who was a lot older than Mum, served in World War II on a bomber squadron with the South African Air Force. And his brother likewise went to North Africa and ended up in Italy with what became sort of re-rolled as the 12th South African Motorized Brigade. And they were the first South African troops to enter combat in Italy. Interestingly, as in some families, there were divided loyalties. My father's father, my grandfather, Carl Olsson, served as Trooper 540 in the Utrecht Vryheid Mounted Police before re-enlisting as Private 540 in 2nd Kitchener's Fighting Scouts. Interestingly, on my maternal side, my great-grandfather Duplessis saw action at Spioenkop, and his son, who's pictured in the old black and white photo here, was Isaac van der Schoof, and he was in fact one of the ZARP, who helped foil the Jamison raid at the start of the Boer War. The picture next to that is of myself starting my national service in South Africa in 1985. And if you're looking for me, I'm very well camouflaged in the bottom left of that photograph. So in terms of my first sort of exposure to gunshot wounds, the first time that I attended a gunshot wound was actually at the age of 16. I'd joined the South African police as a reservist or a special constable, and I ended up attending an attempted robbery, which ended up in someone being shot and me applying some very basic first aid skills at that time to that particular fellow. When I met my life partner in 1998, we ended up migrating to the UK in 2000. And in 2008, I joined the MOD as a specialist paramedic, as Derek has said, on global and domestic operations, and served in Afghanistan and other places in Southeast Asia. So in terms of the the background, my background in medicine, I thought I'd add a couple of quotes in as to the where sort of medicine originally came from, and I wanted to add in the fact that Hippocrates once said, "Wherever the art of medicine is loved, there is also a love of humanity." And more recently, Paul de Crave said, "Medicine is love, otherwise it's worthless." And I thought those would be quite poignant to add in. So, as we know, military medicine in early times was often brutal. Wars in the 19th century were accompanied by very heavy loss of life, not only from the actual wounds that were inflicted, but from infectious diseases. We know that disease caused more deaths than those caused by enemy actions. And for example, during the Peninsular War, for every soldier dying of a wound, there were 4 who succumbed to disease. And the 3 major conflicts taking place during this time, the Peninsular War, the Crimean War, and the Boer War, certainly highlighted that. We know that often sort of damage control surgery was carried out very swiftly, had to be performed at speed, simply because there was not an understanding of anesthetics, and the wounded often died during the procedures, and surgeons were often focusing their attention on wounds of the arms and legs, because limbs were both easily accessible, and of course, the surgeons wanted to sort of lend themselves more to amputating in certain cases, unlike sort of organs inside the abdomen and the chest. And this was commonly the operation of choice, as in the amputations for many war wounds, for many combatants. So abdominal and chest wounds weren't treated, weren't able to be treated simply because of a lack of understanding. And as an important development, we know that anesthesia helped develop, as it became available during the Crimean War, helped develop battlefield surgery. However, whilst it certainly rendered operations pain-free, it was associated with numbers of fatalities and mortality, simply because they didn't understand the effects that anesthetics had, particularly on the cardiovascular system. And so as a result, operative surgery didn't extend its scope a great deal, and military surgery remained primarily focused on the limbs. Now, when the Boer War came along, interestingly, few amputations were performed. And this was sort of as a result of Britain sending observers to understand the medical and surgical aspects of war. For example, the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, and the Russo-Japanese War, which resulted in very significant advances in surgery for abdominal wounds. There was a Russian female surgeon called Vera Gedroitz, and Dr. Gedroitz is seen here with Sister of Mercy, Empress Fyodorovna. And as a result, when the Great War began in 1914, lessons that had been learned previously had to be relearned by British surgeons as many soldiers had penetrating abdominal wounds and unfortunately lost their lives when they shouldn't necessarily have. Vera Gedreutz she was a physician, a doctor of medicine, who'd studied in Lausanne in Switzerland, and became the first person in the world, as far as I know, to perform abdominal surgery on the battlefield during the Russo-Japanese conflict. And she sort of pretty much pioneered rapid triage and operative management for penetrating abdominal wounds and treated injured soldiers from both sides. In the earliest sort of medical services of the British Armed Forces, which date back to King Charles II's formation of the regular standing army in the 1660s, at that time, each regiment was provided with a surgeon and an assistant surgeon, both usually as commissioned officers, and these men usually accompanied their units and in campaigns across the globe. But in 1855, as we've mentioned, amid a severe public outcry and criticism of the lack of medical provision, a unified corps was formed to source medical personnel from other ranks. And this was renamed the Army Hospital Corps in 1857, and then the Medical Staff Corps in 1884. And then, meanwhile, the allocation of medical officers to each regiment was abolished in 1873. And in its place, a centralized service was established, with these officers becoming the Army Medical Staff in 1884. And then in 1898, they merged to form the Royal Army Medical Corps. And in October in 1854, for example, the Times ran a series of articles by Thomas Chenery, who was their correspondent in Constantinople, who decried the insufficiency of the provision of medical care for British soldiers serving there, and going as far as to criticize the lack of surgeons, nurses, and even medical supplies. As we mentioned, a lot of medical and battlefield surgery has had to be relearned over time. Similar to the South African conflict between 1966 and 1990, which was the so-called border war, which was not actually a war by classic standards, as it really sort of, at the same time, it sort of excludes those exact definitions, but it was still a protracted insurgency. And the South African Medical Corps had actually made some amazing leaps in terms of battlefield trauma and life support, but these tended to be forgotten as we were quite an isolated nation at the time. But we do know that the Soviets had funded the effort to the tune of about $2 billion. So in terms of Afghanistan as a country, it has been dubbed the graveyard of civilizations. We know that the British Empire fought 3 wars there between 1839 and 1919, with the First Anglo-Afghan War seeing a retreating British army, who were pretty much wiped out in the winter snows of the Hindu Kush in 1842, with around 4,500 troops lost, along with about 12,000 civilians. While the Second Anglo-Afghan War went better for the British between 1878 and 1880, the Third Anglo-Afghan War in 1919 then saw the Central Asian nation regain its independence. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan at the peak of its strength during the Cold War, they very swiftly became bogged down by the insurgent troops, collectively known as the Mujahideen, who were receiving US support. And only after suffering around 14,500 military deaths and a further approximately 54,000 wounded soldiers, the USSR then withdrew from Afghanistan in 89 in defeat. So in terms of the origin of IRT or MERT, which was the immediate response team or the medical evacuation response team, MERT remains a well-known British medical evacuation capability and asset that was used specifically on Operation Herrick. But it was the dedication of those who crewed the IRT in places like Bosnia all the way through to Iraq, who actually proved that you could actually take the the care to the battlefield. The concept of placing clinicians on UK military helicopters isn't new and probably predated the introduction of the helicopter emergency services. And anecdotally, the presence of a doctor and a helicopter for medevac has existed for as long as helicopters have been in service. The RAF concept of the immediate response team based on helicopters that were used in the Bosnian conflict was usually consisting of a single paramedic or a single flight nurse who were embarked on either a Merlin or a Royal Navy Sea King. And then depending on the severity of the injury, a nearby medical officer may have also embarked. But the presence of that particular medical officer was generally fortuitous, as they were not usually dedicated to IRT taskings and held regimental medical duties elsewhere. Then at some point between the Bosnian campaign and Operation Talek in Iraq, the term MERT was introduced to recognize that an IRT didn't necessarily always need or require a force protection element or a firefighting element. And then given that the MERT was originally an RAF capability, the way in which 16 close medical support regiments adopted and amended this concept will now be examined further, and particularly how they came to place consultants on medevac missions. We know that the capability was demonstrated as far back as 2005, when during a parachute regiment exercise in Africa, the level of medical risk outweighed the capability that the RMO, or the regimental medical officer, was willing and professionally able to provide. And 16X Ford deployed a light surgical unit to reinforce the medical officer. And this proved quite sort of fortuitous and prescient, as there was a parachuting accident which resulted in a paratrooper falling a significant height from an aircraft into the drop zone without his canopy deploying. The paratrooper was immediately ventilated by a member of the LSG who had forward deployed, and he was transferred by helicopter and subsequently from there to a light aircraft onto Botswana and then on to Johannesburg. Now, this paratrooper survived. He made a full recovery. And this intervention was declared the first time a British casualty had actually been ventilated in a drop zone. And while this is probably true, at least within my understanding, other evidence does suggest that ventilated patients had previously been transported from very close to the point of injury and by other units under the aegis of the RAF. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the advances in battlefield trauma. We know that once deployed in theatre, the attitude that led 16X to create MERT meant that they were always looking for new ways to improve levels of care and enhance their performance as medical clinicians. And as an example, it became, for someone who's suffered a battlefield injury, it's quite difficult sometimes to find venous access. So to provide an IV line, for example, to give life-saving drugs, and specifically for giving medicines such as whole blood and plasma. And so clinicians from MSW who were also in theatre were also authorized to use what's known as intraosseous drill. Essentially, it looks a bit like a little Dremel, and it provides a rapid access through a wide bore cannula directly into the bone marrow. So given the background of clinicians on MERT and their sort of undoubted competence, the fact that they weren't initially supplied with this equipment, really lent itself to a tri-service effort to improve the levels of care that were being provided. So we know that close 16X or 16 Close Medical Support Regiment of the Royal Army Medical Corps were formed in 1999, and they were formed from an amalgamation of 19 air mobile field ambulance and 23 parachute field ambulance. And between them, they've actually been involved in every major operation since World War II, so quite pedigree. In terms of the actual equipment that you'll see on the screen, the far left photo shows part of my team, so nurse, emergency consultant, and my opposite paramedic number doing an equipment check. We can see from the cardboard box there that we'd repurposed, that we carried whole blood. In terms of drugs, we carried a whole raft of anesthetic drugs, including things like suxamethonium and other very effective pain-relieving drugs such as ketamine. Things like morphine really wouldn't be touching someone who had, for example, a traumatic amputation. The other interesting thing to note is you'll see from the bottom photo what looks like a patient inside some sort of thermal blanket. And what these are is they're actually self-heating sleeping bags. In terms of combat sort of injuries and catastrophic hemorrhage, once we start losing a significant amount of blood, our body goes acidotic and we start becoming hypothermic. So even in temperatures of 40 and 50 degrees Celsius, we were wrapping casualties in these self-heating blankets to aid the clotting process along with the drugs, and then obviously delivering a lot of casualties to hospital that would not normally have survived. So we can see here some whole blood, some frozen plasma, and then a drug called tranexamic acid. For those of you who watch anything to do with air ambulance in the UK, you'll know that essentially you've got an ED consultant going out on certain shouts to look after patients. And giving whole blood and plasma and tranexamic acid is certainly one of the reasons that we managed to recover so many of our battlefield casualties and get some of them home. This piece of kit here is quite interesting. It's essentially what looks like a sort of a portable battery, along with a cartridge, a device, which is called an N-flow. And you'll see it's attached to a bag of fluids. Now, this small device here is actually sits on a metal base plate. And what happens is once you connect the fluids up to the battery pack, it can heat the whatever fluid you put in through there, including whole blood and plasma, up to body temperature within 2 seconds. So we were able to give warm fluid to battlefield casualties on scene, essentially. Now, along with a lot of the other adjuncts, we were using things like the combat application tourniquets and a very clever gauze called Celox. There are many other brands available now, but essentially what Celox did was, what it is it's an impregnated gauze bandage, which is impregnated with chitosan, which is derived from shellfish. Cleverly, they managed to extract the sort of harmful components of it. So even if someone was allergic to to shellfish, we could still use that on a battlefield casualty. Unfortunately, now we know that due to sort of the escalating violence in some cities, there are things called bleed kits, which are readily available next to AEDs, defibrillators, which you can unlock in the case of, say, a stab wound or a gunshot wound, worst case in extremis. And what we would do is we would pack these bits of gauze into gunshot wounds and other fairly sort of large penetrating wounds. So, for example, someone who had been blown up by an IED and who'd lost, perhaps they were bilateral amputee, both legs, up into the perineum, so going up into the body cavity almost. We managed to rescue and return a number of casualties with those types of injuries. So in terms of resource management, the whole concept of Merck was doctor-led, but essentially we also had, essentially we also had an emergency nurse with us, as well as an element of force protection. Sometimes someone from Royal Signals, if one of the paramedics were going off the back of the helicopter just to maintain comms. You could probably see that we're carrying PRRs. So these were secure sort of close proximity radios so that we could stay in touch with each other if someone had to go off the back of the helicopter. So in this particular photo, you can see the container containing the whole blood. And then this is part of my team. At the rear of the Chinook, in this case, we can see the force protection element. They were provided largely by the RAF regiment. And quite often we flew, as I said, with either signaller or special forces medic who was in training or coming to support us. In terms of the aircraft, primarily the CH-47 Mark 3s and 4s is what I flew on my first tours in Afghanistan. You'll know that we were supported by the Apaches as our top cover. And I worked quite hard to actually sort of, from a morale point of view, to include them in our afternoon teas, which we try to have along with the pilots and the weapons operators, simply as I say, a morale boosting exercise. Because until I'd arrived in theatre, the Army Air Corps had been excluded from the afternoon teas, but they were certainly our top cover and our lifeline, and looking after us while we were either en route or on the ground. Now, when I started my training with the RAF, we initially start on fixed wing aircraft. This particular aircraft here is US Air Force Special Forces aircraft, and you'll see from the interior that there was adopted, obviously, and adapted for transferring casualties within Afghanistan. Some of the other aircraft we used were the Merlin. Problem with Merlin, well, not the problem, but the challenge with the Merlin for us was had either very light or no armor at all, and didn't lend itself very well in terms of room in the back to transporting multiple casualties. So as you'll see here, Merlin on the left, that's been rolled for MERT, and then the Chinook, the CH-47. So that's carrying from all the way forward of the cockpit. You'll see we have a LACON or a resupply container here, which carries, we carried consumables with, and then coming back the way, you'll notice the port and starboard sides where we try to sort of mirror them. So you'll see spinal boards, you'll see an oxygen container, which is contained, an F-size oxygen cylinder, which is contained within another container here, bearing in mind that a lot of this equipment had to be ratified and passed as airworthy. And then coming down, usually the nurse would have been on the port side, two paramedics on the starboard side. You'll see just peeping out there some clinical waste and sharps bins. And then you might just see one of the suction units down the bottom here. And then coming closer towards us, you'll see where the force protection have their kit. And then right on the starboard side, you'll notice a stretcher called a Talon, which is a collapsible sort of portable combat stretcher. We carried spares so we could replan, obviously, if we went out to a call sign and their casualty was on a stretcher, that they would have a replan of a fresh stretcher. So this is the interior of one of the US Air Force Parajumpers Black Hawk helicopters, just to give you an idea of the closeness or the proximity or the lack of space in there. They've got one casualty on board, as you can see in the foreground, but not a lot of space for maneuver. So again, if we compare those to the Chinook and the Merlin, a lot more space on the Chinook. This is one of the casualty sort of clinical studies that I wanted to share with you just very quickly. What had happened in this instance was that James had been out with his patrol and suffered a gunshot wound. I did have a sound clip. Unfortunately, it's not playing, but happy to share that out when the slide deck goes out to Chris for putting onto the site, so that you can actually hear James talking a bit about his experience and what occurred. And In this particular instance, James was shot through the right arm by what they think was a sniper at fairly close range, which pretty much shattered his ulnar bone on his right hand. So his primary weapon arm became ineffective or he was unable to use that. Some of the troops carried their secondary arms or pistols and holsters on their vests. In this particular instance, James was able to reach and to get to his pistol, provide a little suppressing fire along with his colleagues, and then managed to get into cover. You'll notice that there was a significant amount of blood prior to me arriving on scene, and the combat medical technician, so the army medic, has applied a CAT or combat tourniquet to his arm to help with blood flow. And you'll also notice on there the Ols or Israeli sort of style bandage there, which would have given a bit more tension and stopped the flow of blood. Direct pressure is still a very acceptable way of and a stepwise approach of trying to stop a bleed. So often en route, we were dealing with multiple casualties. My first day as primary paramedic or lead paramedic involved an explosion in a market with 150 casualties. And this happened near Babaji in Helmand province. I remember landing on with the US Air Force parajumpers approximately the same time. And they were asking how many casualties we could take on our helicopter. I think we ended up taking 9 casualties in our first run, and then continued to fly for about 3 or 4 hours. So we had mainly civilian casualties, ranging in age from babies to adults. So that was a bit of a baptism by fire for myself on that particular first day. Once arriving at Bastion, we were ably assisted quite ably by the force protection. So in this case, the RAF regiment. For those of you who've been to Bastion, you'll know that the HLS was a little way from the hospital. And what we would do is we would load patients onto the BFCs or the field ambulances for the short journey over to the hospital. And then once we arrived at the hospital, as the lead paramedic, I would go off, for example, while they were getting the patient or the casualty onto the gurney and go straight into the bay. There would be a consultant meeting me at the door, say bay 3, for example, and I would go in and do my sort of recognized handover, which is MIST. It's the mechanism, injury, signs and symptoms, and treatment given. Going back a few steps, we would also try and add in at MIST, so age of the patient, the time of the incident, and then the mechanism, injuries, their signs and symptoms, and then the treatment that we'd given en route. In this particular case, this casualty is ventilated, as you can see, with a CPAP, and they're inside the self-heating blanket there. So this is James's injury here. You'll see the right ulnar completely shattered. I do have other photographs, but I did promise you non-gory photographs. But you could get a good idea of the amount of damage there. James was flown back to the UK and treated at RCDM in Birmingham. Was given a skin graft where his arm was grafted onto his stomach for some time, and he went on to make a full recovery. This is a photo taken in the ED of Ben Cooper and myself. So Ben is the clinical director for Sheffield Hallam in Sheffield, of course, not Nottingham. And this was after a particularly not so nice job. I think he was trying to cheer me up in this instance here, but yeah, that was what happened at that time. So in terms of some of the armaments that the Chinook carried, they're equipped with 2 7.62 M134 miniguns and 1 7.62 M60. There were the odd occasion where these were fired by various members of the team, not only from a familiarity to getting familiar with them point of view, but also from a training point of view. So we were often being engaged by the enemy. Quite often we would return to base and the technicians would be pulling rounds outside of the armor on the Chinooks. In this particular photo, you can see the countermeasures and flares being fired, and particularly on night missions, that was usually a bit hairy, and knowing that we were, being targeted as such. So this is the side of Merlin. The crew were extremely lucky in this instance. This was actually a rocket-propelled grenade that struck the side of the aircraft. The chap who was meant to be sitting here had actually just moved prior to them taking off, and the RPG actually did it through and through, so it did not actually detonate on hitting the aircraft. But just to give you an idea of how often we were coming in contact with the enemy. So in terms of some of the personal issued firearms, when I did my first deployment, you can see the SA-80 here, which was standard issue at the time. And in terms of my secondary, in this instance, was a Browning high power. I carried Brownings in South Africa for many years. I was familiar with them. Very effective, in my opinion, sidearm, and I was happy for that. We then went on to being issued Glock 17s, and then later on we were issued some of the SIG 226s, as you can see in the next photograph along. In the third photo, you'll see one of the 338s that was issued to the RF regiment as our force protection. And again, we received training and familiarization on, these effective weapon systems. The fourth photo along is on a subsequent tasking in Southeast Asia. And you'll see in this case, I'm carrying a DeMarco C8 or Canadian Colt with various optics. And in that instance, I was carrying a SIG 229. So this is actually my personal issue here. This photo was taken in a roll-on facility that I put together in country, and this particular this bag you can see here is basically a bit of a bug-out bag, and within the bag I carried a sort of very basic medical roll, which included a surgical airway kit. And various other bits and bobs, my own personal issue, morphine, and so on. But I also had a smaller sort of version of the Medberg, which contained some of the more sort of life-saving drugs, etc. And because there was no medical officer in unit, I was authorized to use ketamine in extremis. Just a photo showing you sort of the amount of dust that was thrown up, obviously at the HLS on landing, and just to give you sort of a flavour of what that looked and felt like, really, for the troops on the ground who were popping smoke and waiting for us to come and assist them. So I mentioned other taskings. Post Herrick 11B 12A, I was tasked again. I think I'd been home for 2 months, and there was requirement for a medic for a team going to Southeast Asia, and we did. I completed about 7 months worth of training with them, and we trained with a lot of other interesting, shall I say, domestic agencies, which helped us to, kind of be alive to counter surveillance and all of the other good stuff that goes on. In terms of going in country and being a team that's not necessarily overt, if I can put it that way. So this is me at Hythe on the left, and being the medic, I was working with, shall I say, highly accomplished and experienced marksmen, but I never came last. at least on the qualifying shoots, which was always interesting. And we trained in places like Gravesend, for example, with the Met, and I managed to pretty much outshoot the rest of my team in terms of the pistol, which was quite satisfying. The photo on the right is of us doing anti-ambush drills on the vehicle range at Lyd. In this case, we're mobile in a cav or civilian armored vehicle. In this particular case, it was a Range Rover. And prior to being tasked out and going on deployment, we received a number of vehicles, which for all intents and purposes were civilian looking, but they were bristling with ECM, electronic countermeasures, and various other devices as well for use in country. When we did deploy, eventually we flew out on the Globemaster, the C-17, just my small team and I, and the vehicles that we were tasked in country with. So these are members of the team that I worked with, and obviously for UpSec, I've blanked out their faces, but you can see me on the left. I thought I'd add this in here, perhaps at the end. For those of you who are quite alive to it, you might be able to tell me who that is and perhaps where that photo was taken. The reason I added it in was because I was in a similar part of the world to that individual on one of my taskings. I'd like to make mention at this point of two sort of veterans clubs. One is the Kazabak Club, which includes a lot of the veterans that MERT helped bring home, and also the MERT Club. And you'll see us at Cenotaph every year for remembrance. Usually, I think we take it in turns to march one in front of the other. So I thought I'd just add that in there for interest as well. And in terms of dedication, while I was out in Afghanistan in 2010, sadly, Pedro 66, which was the call sign for one of the parajumper teams, was hit by an RPG, and only two of the crew members survived. So I thought I'd add that in as a dedication to them. So essentially, just to cover why MERT existed on Operic, it's now been shown that the deploying of sort of highly capable medical practitioners to the point of wounding is to save lives, and the fact that a lot of this of these advances in medical technology are now seen on our frontline ambulances. They're seen if you walk past a bleed kit in London, Leeds, or Liverpool or Manchester. And a lot of these innovations were through came about through battlefield injuries. So just in conclusion, an acknowledgement, I'd like to thank you all for your attention this evening. For those of you who have mentored me and your sound advice and friendship and camaraderie in supporting my collecting efforts, and increasing my own knowledge, because every day is a school day, and also in supporting more importantly, the HBSA lecture calendar. I do feel that in terms of succession and those who will come after us, and I include my two sons in this, that we focus collectively on sharing the same fruits of the spirit and celebrating the diversity that makes us individuals in our own way. And to that end, I'd also specifically wish to express my gratitude to those members of the HBSA who continue to fight our corner. And I'd also emphasize that now is the time for solidarity in our circle. If not us, then who will continue this good fight, my friends? And a toast to you all here and absent friends. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you very much indeed for a splendid lecture.